Now I have to remember what I said.
Joan Didion is an interesting
Yeah.
blah, 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 blah.
Blah,
That's as far as I got.
Words.
Welcome to another episode of the Thinking Well and Why podcast, part of the Awareness to Action podcast network. My name is Creek, and I'm here with my co-hosts Mario Sikora and Lee Fields, who the last time they questioned their own narrative realized that they'd conveniently forgotten the question. That daily delusion brought to you by Joan Didion. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. And today we're talking about the brain as a story-making machine, what that buys us and what it costs us. So Mario, tell us a little bit more about this topic.
This is kind of a natural progression from what we've talked about before, right? As we talked about Popper, Popper's whole thing was, knowledge evolves through conjectures and the creation and iteration of theory. Darwin's On the Origin of Species is basically just a beautiful narrative in very non-scientific forms that explains how biology works, right? I mean, it's just a brilliant story. There's no technical jargon in it or anything like that. And again, it captures this idea of iteration. The way humans function, kind of what the brain is all about is to make predictions about what situations we are facing and then to allocate resources accordingly. Okay? So this is what our brain is constantly doing. What's happening around me? What do I need to do about it? Okay. And one of the fascinating things about the human brain is that it has the capacity to kind of store and integrate or internalize stories so that we're not even aware of them anymore, right? We're not even aware that we're living these loops or telling these stories or telling ourselves these stories or responding to these stories. And it's what gets us through the day. This is not a bad thing. There's a great line in the old movie, The Big Chill, where the Jeff Goldblum character is defending rationalizations, right? And he says, hey, don't knock rationalizations. Try getting through the day without one, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same way with stories, right? This is what humans do at our hearts, is we make stories. And I love that Joan Didion quote, right? Because it just sums it up. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. And it works on a very practical, very functional level. And it works on a really nice artistic, metaphysical level as well. So it's a brilliant quote.
I think Joan Didion is a particularly interesting author to cite about the stories that we tell ourselves, because her writing was in the genre of like California Gothic. It was telling, on the one hand, the story of a very sunshiny, utopian California, and on the other, a grittier story that was happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's an interesting author as we're looking at inner work and the stories we tell ourselves about who we need to be and who we think we need to be and who we are.
Yeah.
When we think about stories, I think it's easy to kind of put it in this sort of metaphysical, mythological realm, but it is very much biological.
Yeah.
We tell ourselves stories as we collect data, but really they're about the predictions of the future to help us make meaning, to summarize all the information that we're constantly collecting through our senses and our brain is trying to make sense of. Yeah. And so it's not just a loosey-goosey, squishy storytelling narrative.
Yeah, and and they're verbal and nonverbal, right? There are elements of our stories that are felt rather than, explained. There are elements of our stories that are felt rather than understood. Okay, mm-hmm. And some of these stories are conscious and intentional and deliberate, and others we're just not even aware of, right? And, look, this is why old people keep telling the same stories over and over again, right? I've got this thing, one of my sons, goes to college about a 3.5-hour drive. And so when I go to pick him up for holidays or whatever, we'll have time, and we'll talk. And there are stories that, I know I've told in the past, and he told, and sometimes he says, "Yeah, you told me that one," or other times I'll say, "Did I tell you that story before?" He goes, "Yeah, but I'll let you tell it again," sort of thing, because we're just kind of externalizing these stories we've heard so many times, and the irony is that they always feel kind of fresh to us, even if it's a story we've lived, day in, day out. So, and growth lies for us in the awareness to action approach. It starts with examining and rewriting the narratives. Okay, this is the key thing. Now, I always want to be careful here because every time I start talking about this, everybody says, "Oh, you're just talking about doing cognitive work, and you're ignoring the body and the heart and blah blah blah." No, because it's the emotions that direct us to pay attention to the story, that there's some problem here, right? If I feel anger, that's not just something detached or unrelated to my stories. It's probably caused by something, the story that I'm experiencing now interacting with the story that I have. And it says, "Hey, look at this." And that's when we take over this sort of cognitive aspect of let me rewrite the story. And then we have to have, again, the emotional experience of do I act on this or not, right? What do I do? How do I decide how to choose? So please, please, please don't assume that just because we're putting so much emphasis on narratives and growth that we're ignoring the importance of emotions or, other quote unquote ways of knowing.
Right. It's the storytelling is the shorthand for the meaning that we're making of the things and what's driving us to react to that,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Look, you can't change a story unless you become aware of it and intentionally rewrite it. Okay?
Mhm.
Sometimes we do it unintentionally, but that's not always the most effective way to do it. Sometimes we do it unintentionally in positive ways, sometimes in negative ways. But it's the real path to growth is the intentional rescripting of our stories in response to reality.
It's rescripting both in intentional storytelling from a cognitive perspective, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also important to have a behavioral element as well of having
Yeah.
emotionally corrective experiences. That because sometimes, no matter how many times I run through the awareness to action approach, trying to, I'll feel more unique when it still doesn't take until I actually have the experience of like, oh, I'm okay when this happened.
Mm-hmm.
And no amount of journaling is going to get me there until I have an actual experience where my brain actually starts to trust that I have the capability to handle something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, look, and that's why action is the third step, right? I mean, you have to go out and do something, okay? Because if all we're doing is sitting around contemplating and telling ourselves new stories, they just drift away unless we anchor them through some kind of action. Okay? And that action doesn't have to be, something specifically behavioral. It can be, start noticing my emotions more, right? Kind of lean into my joy more, examine my sorrow more, whatever it is. But you have to do something, or else you're writing a story on sand. Okay?
Um, I would push just a bit back on the language of that, that it's not just writing a story on sand, it's actually reinforcing an existing story by not changing, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're you're teaching your brain that the new idea that you had didn't work
Yeah.
because you didn't actually try it,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's why having the awareness piece is so important. Having a tool to be able to help you become more aware is so vital. But then actually practicing using it and intentionally remembering that you are trying something new and teaching yourself a new pattern is so important to actually lasting change or growth.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, if we, our stories are often in response to what we're experiencing emotionally, physically, interpersonally, whatever it is. So action, and that action may just be hearing something that somebody says to us, triggers a narrative. Okay. And so these things are all interwoven with each other. And, one might argue that I cannot spend any time, working on my stories, and I can just do some sort of a physical exercise, say, or a breathing exercise, and have transformation. Okay, maybe, right? But it'll go faster if you tie it to some cognitive rewriting of the narrative. And you have to make a conscious decision to start practicing those breathing exercises. And you have to come up with a reason why it makes sense to do that. Okay, so we just can't, it's necessary but not sufficient to write, to work on rewriting our stories, is, I guess, the point.
I'm curious I'm not entirely sure what answer I'm expecting from this, but I'm curious if you could categorize the different types of stories that we tell ourselves.
Oh, that's good. Let's see. Wow. I don't have a set of, category A, category B, right? But there are stories that we tell ourselves to protect ourselves. There are stories we tell ourselves to motivate us. There are stories we tell to comfort us, right? I mean, they fall into, I would say that there are, look, pretty much anything we do and any end we're trying to achieve, we tell some story, either implicitly or explicitly, verbally or non-verbally, to get there. I think, there was I wish I could remember. Let's see, an Indian spiritual teacher I followed for a while. No, it's just a guy nobody would have heard of. But it was a secret wisdom school that only I was part of.
You are the Batman. Got it.
No, it was actually a guy named Swami Chaitanananda. And
there you go.
No,
rolls off the tongue.
Yes,
I don't know it, but wait, no, now I know. Okay. Okay, you were saying.
Yeah.
Who was it again?
He used to talk about eating yesterday's breakfast all the time, right? His real name was Michael something, too. He was an American guy. But anyway. But yeah, so, and this is often what we're doing, right? And we're just telling ourselves these things on loops. And we have these stories that, just reinforce all of our biases and all of our prejudices and all of our defenses and all of our pains and sufferings and resentments and criticisms that we're just doing over and over and over in a loop, eating yesterday's breakfast and wondering why we don't find this satisfying. Okay. So I just share that in terms of kinds of stories. And I think that's an important one to understand, that repetitive feels comforting, but is really just ultimately unsatisfying and doesn't move us forward.
Creek, when you asked the question, the thought that came to my mind were two categories, fiction and nonfiction, and that we conflate them. And I think that's sort of where inner work, the tool we use is the Enneagram, but that's kind of where that storytelling, moving from being a skill of awareness to a tool of practicing telling a different story by being aware of the story you're telling and the limits that it has, right? If this is my narrative and I'm taking myself that I have to be this way or I am this way, then sort of challenging that narrative and rewriting that story is where the resistance and where the growth comes in, right? And that's where it moves into being a tool.
I tell you what, if any of you out there have the pleasure of interacting with either two of these people, they love giving answers, So you just toss them a question and you'll get something back. Some of the listeners may know I sometimes refer to Lee as Lee GPT because I'm just like, I have a thought, and I just say the thought, and then 15 minutes later, I'm like, that was a good conversation, Lee. Thanks. I've, yeah. She's like,
Creek,
I've
you're a
reached
good
my
questioner.
usage limit.
90% usage limit.
Come back in 10 hours. And we'll,
Yeah. Friends and family, you come back in 5.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or you can spend more money.
Yes.
So, Lee, you mentioned Enneagram stuff. Let's talk about the bridge of storytelling in Enneagram. We've mentioned it a little bit more, but more specifically.
Can I first?
What do we need to have before that?
If we don't mind, before we go that direction.
Not sure we have a choice.
Which
we.
I want to tie this to clear thinking, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because the important thing here is that, and Lee, I love the fiction nonfiction analogy, so that was great, and it's pertinent to what I'm about to say. All our stories don't have to be that rigorous, right? You know, why do we like a sunset? I just do, right? Mm-hmm. It's just cool. It's pretty, you know, that sort of thing. Other things we need to be more rigorous about. Okay. So fictional stories, you know, we're just making them up. Okay. They're subjective. They don't have to be true. In fact, the definition of them is that they're not true or, you know, necessarily following a set of facts. Nonfiction stories do need to adhere to a certain degree of rigor, okay, if they are to be reliable. Okay, now one of the problems about books is that they typically don't have fact checkers, right? So pretty much any book can frame itself as nonfiction and, you know, be fiction, you know, in a way. But the reason that clear thinking skills are so important is so that the quality and accuracy and authenticity of our stories will be more accurate. And that can even help when it comes to our subjective feel-good stories. And I'll give an example of that, right? So if you can look over my shoulder here, I have this picture of Muhammad Ali standing over Sonny Liston, okay? Creek, were you going to say something?
This is an audio podcast.
This is audio. Okay, well, I'm just talking to the two of you here. We don't have any listeners. So everybody, who cares, right? So
he's painting a mental picture for people who are into that kind of thing.
Well, it's a very famous picture, right? It's one of the more famous pictures in sports, and I'm sure our 6 listeners will have, you know, at least one of them will have seen it. But if you look at this picture without context, it looks like Ali is standing over a prone Liston, gloating after knocking him out. Okay, but that's not actually what's happening here. Okay, what is happening here is that this was the result of what was famously called the Phantom Punch in the Liston Ali 2 fight. Okay, and what that means is Ali threw this perfect right cross that was so fast and so short that people in the audience didn't see it, and it hit Liston right on the chin. Okay. And there was a lot of talk about this fight being fixed because Liston was supposed to be unbeatable and he was associated with the mafia and all these sort of things. And Liston went down and Ali was so frustrated knowing that it was going to look like it was fixed and knowing that he was not going to get the credit he deserved, that he was yelling at Liston to get up. Okay. Get up. I want people to know that I beat you. Okay. So that's 2 very different interpretations of this story. One, you know, based on knowing things, and the other based on whatever assumptions we bring to it. And looking at that, and look at this arrogant guy gloating over a downed foe. No, what to me this picture represents is somebody so dedicated to their craft and so filled with pride and self-regard that they want this done the right way. Okay, so learning to tie clear thinking skills to the stories we tell makes them more useful, okay, makes them more robust. So again, depending on what narrative you have about this picture here, you take 2 very different things away from it, one of them fairly negative, the other, from my perspective at least, more uplifting. And we have to be able to look at our stories and ask ourselves, okay, am I getting the facts right here? Okay. Are there facts and factual errors that are undermining my stories? This is where a lot of prejudices come in, right? A lot of our stories are just prejudices in some ways, or a lot of our prejudices are just, unskillful stories. So we have to learn to question them. We have to learn to challenge them. We have to learn, when is our story making some sort of non-fictional fact claim that I need to check and make sure it's okay. And when is it, you know what, doesn't care, doesn't matter what the facts are, right? This is a story, doesn't have any factual relevance, but it makes me feel okay. And both versions of those stories are okay at the right time.
At the risk of a possible eye roll, I want to also put in there something I'm learning and working through and trying to find how to apply, because it's not just apply critical thinking skills to everything. It's almost like at what distance does critical thinking need to be applied? You know, when I feel a sense of love towards someone, or I feel a sense of love towards me, I don't need to tear that apart and try to understand it and find the factual nature of it. I can, to a certain extent, when it comes to hormones and whatever. Or are we talking about the like myth and stories about from culture that inform, that take a lot of complexity and put it in a more accessible format for people to digest? The things that we passed on generation and generation and generation, maybe not factually true, can be completely torn apart historically, but the lesson that's being given through that is far more important than its factuality. And so just what distance in what I'm trying to say is like, there's applying critical thinking, and then the next, what I'm realizing, there's a distance that I need to figure out, where does it need to sit, and what posture do I need to be at for these particular stories.
Mm-hmm. So it's context and consequence. Okay. What I mean by that is, what are the consequences of inaccuracies in the story? And this is actually a good place to uh, mention the difference between critical thinking and clear thinking. Okay. So, critical thinking is generally testing for the accuracy of something, or, looking for the errors in it, or, more deeply trying to understand the implications of it and so forth. Whereas clear thinking is just making sure that we're bringing the right mindset to the story for the circumstances and the consequences. Myth is, fiction, art is hugely valuable, and it teaches us things about human nature. Look, Hamlet is not necessarily a, factually accurate story. There was a castle in Elsinore. I've been there. It's amazing. It's cool to go there and say, man, this is Hamlet's castle. But Hamlet didn't really exist, But reading Hamlet makes your life richer and teaches you things about life that, the story of the real Prince of Denmark may not have. Okay, so these things absolutely have their places. It's why we tell our kids fables, okay, because they teach us lessons about life. And it's, I mean, look, it doesn't matter that the tortoise and the hare weren't actually racing, I mean, it's, that they probably didn't talk or have anything to do with each other, but that's a good, useful story for teaching. So it's all about, the consequence. Is there any consequence to, telling a fable about, talking animals or something? No, not really. Kids know that animals don't talk. We don't have to say, okay, look now, remember that, this didn't really happen. But where we have a responsibility is when we start venturing into fact claims and asserting things as factually true when they are not. But I don't know anybody, there's this tendency, C.P. Snow wrote a book called the Two Cultures, I think, or where he talked about science and the humanities and often the conflict between them. And what he stated and what I have found to be true is that people who are more grounded in the humanities often end up accusing people who are more grounded in the sciences of being more single-minded when in fact the reality is true. Okay. I've never heard anybody who's a practicing scientist or is very science minded saying, you know what, the arts are not useful at all and you shouldn't tell your kids stories and blah, blah. I've never heard anybody say that. Okay. But I've often hear people in the humanities, and I'm one, that's what my educational background is in, often saying, oh, these scientists, they only see things one dimensional and they're, blah, 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 blah. It's just not true, right? So, yeah, these things are not mutually exclusive. It's all about understanding what are the consequences of believing the facts of, that are a myth as factual. Um, if that's a problem, then we shouldn't. We should caveat it. But here's the bigger story.
To add on to that a little bit, I'm sure, I mean, you two have kids. I don't. I live with a couple that adopted a kid back in 2020, a few years ago. And so I have some semblance of that. But experiencing love is different than analyzing love. And I often use the analogy of sometimes I find myself getting caught in kind of pinning the butterfly down and analyzing it, dissecting it, understanding it, marveling at it. It's completely different to watch it fly. And that's where, for me, it's like sometimes I need to turn off my critical brain in order to just experience it, the complexity, all the different categories, and just let it be one experience instead of parsed into 1,000 pieces. And that's kind of what I hear you all saying.
And the gift is to be able to toggle back and forth between the two modes, right? This is the whole Richard Feynman Rose analogy, right? There's that recording you can find on YouTube of the physicist Richard Feynman talking about a conversation he had with a poet or artist friend about a rose. And the guy says to him, you scientists, you just, to you don't get the experience of smelling a rose like the artist does. And Feynman said, well, I might not have your sophisticated palate and, artistic sensibility, but I love the smell of a rose. And I understand why roses are the color that they are, and I understand how photosynthesis works and so on. And basically saying I can toggle back and forth. And Feynman's an interesting character because he was a bongo player and very much an epicurist in life to say the least. But so that's what we want to bring to us. Sometimes a rose is just a rose. I want to smell it. It's pretty. I like it. Sunset's beautiful, and it's cool to understand it too.
It makes me think, actually, of one of my favorite songs by John Craigie. And one of the lyrics is, you're doing it wrong, dissecting the bird to find the song. It's really great. It's a really great line. Lee?
Yeah. I was just going to say that's pretty much the ball game, right? Why we're here talking about clear thinking is where we can have a mind that can perceive reality in a clearer way, use the tools that we have to help understand ourselves and others better, and then go live life.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's part of the whole awareness to action ethos is don't mess with stuff that's working okay enough. Spend your energy where things need to be improved and you're uniquely qualified to do the improving, and get some good tools and just live your life. You're not broken. You just need a little help. Get the help and go on.
Yeah.
Unpin the butterfly.
Yeah. I'll expand on that slightly. So, for me, I was having a conversation with a client the other day. He's a CEO of a company, and we were talking about how he because of the structure of the organization, is involved in too many things, right? And he's trying to get uninvolved in things. And he said to me, you know what? I'm actually a lazy person. I don't want to work as hard as I do. Okay? I don't want to be involved in as many things as I am. I want to just putter around in the morning and, and take the weekends off and do all these sort of things. And my approach to working on ourselves is partly because I'm kind of lazy, right? I just want to, you know what, man, I just want to sit and watch Netflix at night, and, I want to sit down on my deck and smoke a cigar and, just not have to be dealing with all the dramas and all the inefficiencies that we create in our own lives by being ineffective and not having
Mm-hmm.
skillful relationships. And I want to find the easiest way to make those things go away, right? Just,
Mm-hmm.
I keep
Yeah.
telling people, look, I really want you to go away. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to get you fixed as quickly as we can so I don't have to think about you anymore, So
Put that
Oh,
on your website.
right.
I just want you gone. Yeah.
Man,
Oh,
that's
man.
guerrilla marketing if I ever heard it. So, like we have done in the past few episodes, we like to tie in a little bit of Enneagram. Though this is not an explicitly Enneagram podcast, we do find it to be a very helpful and useful tool. And it's the reason we're all, dare I say, friends, hesitantly.
Don't dare.
Just don't.
Despite
Go away.
Mario wanting you to go away.
No, look, I do love you both, right? But I want you to go away. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
That was the transition. That means
That was the
That was the
transition.
transition.
Okay.
That means you talk
Yeah.
now.
Somebody pick up that frisbee from Creek.
Yeah. How does storytelling, the narratives we tell ourselves, show up in the Enneagram? I have to do all the work here.
I'm creating space for Lee here. So go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks. Here I go. I'll transmit for the lot of you. I think that the storytelling is all over the Enneagram. It's pointing to the beliefs that we have consciously and non-consciously about who we think we need to be okay in the world. And however we define that, whatever that strategy is, has stuff that we implicitly resist because it seems to contradict that strategy, whether we're consciously aware of it and making decisions about it, or just have a sense that that's not the way you do it. And so we're running an inner dialogue, whether we hear it or not, that's giving us instructions on what to do next. And so being aware of that and to some degree categorizing it into a recognizable pattern that's shorthanded enough that we can apply it quickly is what the Enneagram model is a useful tool for. Awareness, recognizing the pattern, understanding the logic of the pattern, getting a little deeper down and seeing what the secondary ramifications of that logic might be, and then deciding if this is the response that we should have in the moment when there's friction. That's what it is. It's a problem resolution protocol in the language of awareness to action, and to a certain degree, an operations manual. Flip to this tab and try that, and that's where the rewriting the habituated story comes in. You're teaching yourself a new story. You're writing a new chapter, whatever analogy you want to make of it. You're flipping the script. Sometimes. That's why it's useful.
So narratives are important to the Enneagram for a couple of ways, right? So number one is that what do I do with the Enneagram that Lee was just talking about, right? So it is the mechanism I use to help me understand my stories so I can then rewrite them into more skillful narratives. We also have to, I think, if people use the Enneagram professionally in some way or use it to help people, or even just use it in their own development, they have to understand that the body of knowledge that we call the Enneagram is just a story itself, right? I mean, it is a kind of cobbled together body of information and assumption that is in the process of continually being rewritten. It's continually being rewritten because people have newer and deeper insights into things, or they stop believing certain parts of it that they thought were true, or they find new ways to apply it. They bring their own perspective to it, whether that perspective be because of, their own Enneagram type or their culture or their environment or their specific application of it. So it's an ongoing thing. And we have to be careful with all stories about assuming that they are the full story, right? Because, there really aren't any stories that are the whole story. And so we have to keep that in mind, that every story starts at a point and ends at a point and doesn't capture the rest. Okay. So I think when we're working with the Enneagram, we have to recognize it as a story. And we can edit, revise, update it as we go. But again, we should be rigorous in our doing so, right? We should be making sure that it is externally and internally consistent as we rewrite this story. So it helps to, in our work with the Enneagram, to practice good storytelling principles as we go through these iterations. I think we also have to watch for the ways that it can trap us into constricted and bound stories. We can see ourselves as an 8 or a 1 or a 4 and lose the bigger picture of who we are. And we see this all the time when you're around people who are familiar with the Enneagram and talking about it. And when somebody does something representative of their type, everybody goes, "Oh, what a 4," right? But
It's always the fours.
It's always the 4s because
Yeah.
there's so. Yeah. I'm just trying to spread the love here, and not talk about 8s all the time, right? So, but we miss all the things that the 4 was doing that weren't 4ish. Okay? So our stories can become constricted about ourselves and about people if we give the Enneagram too much weight in that story. And this is one of my big, I wrote I'm noticing a theme in myself here now. I wrote an article one time called "Please Don't Tell Me Your Story." So,
Very inviting.
Please go away. Please don't tell me your story.
Please go.
Please leave me alone.
He did say please.
Yeah.
Okay. Manners matter.
And what the gist of it was, and I just come from an Enneagram conference, and I was just so tired of people coming up to me and starting off with, "Hi, I'm so and so, I'm a 7," and because I'm a 7, I just love these kind of conferences because the 7 in me gets so excited, and it's like, oh my God, man, you are the most boring person I've met since the last person who came along and did the same thing to me. I don't care what your Enneagram type. I always tell people your Enneagram type is the least interesting thing about you to me. Okay. Because all you're doing there is telling me the ways in which you are just like 1 out of 9 every other people on the planet. Okay. Tell me the ways in which you're you. That's the part of the story that I'm interested in. Okay. So we have to be careful that we don't let the Enneagram become our story, because it's a boring story.
And I think that's I'll pat you on the back a little bit, not too much, but why the awareness to action model works, helps to work against that, because it taps into the verbs, into process, into the evolution of who you are. And instead of, then it becomes a tool for discovering parts of who you are, the stories you're telling yourself. But like you said, it's not there to tell you your stories. It's there to help you find your stories.
I was just going to say, it helps you find the dull. It helps point out the boring parts of your story for you so you can take them out,
That's not what I was going to say.
Yeah, I know, but go ahead.
I was going to talk about how limitation can be generative, right? And having just the Goldilocks amount of the Enneagram
Yeah.
is really useful.
Yeah.
Right. But if we get into too immersed in it,
Yeah.
then we're not even really telling what I'm hearing you say is we're not even really telling our own story anymore. We're recalling facts that we understand about a model.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And applying them to ourselves, maybe rationalizing ourselves. We're understanding ourselves through it, which makes it a really appealing, like catnip of a tool. Because, oh, I see myself. I understand myself better with this tool. And it's just a fine perforated line between understanding yourself better and over identifying with something. I think that's where the danger comes in using the Enneagram generally, is stepping into this sort of dynamic system that's talking about the complexity of being human. And then as soon as you get on the carousel, stopping the ride and thinking that that is the ride. And it's really, no, that's just the map of the park or whatever. I'm losing the analogy, but you get the idea.
Mm-hmm.
You become stuck in the story of what it means to be an Enneagram type instead of what it means to be a human who understands this part of how they human and then keep humaning. It's just like it becomes a lifestyle instead of a reference material. And it's understandable, right? You see yourself, you recognize yourself, this is amazing. But you want to use it in your heavy quotes real life, not just get stuck in the awareness.
Creek, I'm going to ask you to come up with a musical analogy or version of what I'm about to say here. So, look, I'm not denigrating the Enneagram here, in this way, right? I mean, I've devoted 30 years of my life to working with it and teaching it. But if we don't use it in the right way, and if our narrative comes becomes fixated on it, and we lose this deeper sense of who we really are, forget about this deeper sense of who we really are, it's almost like this act of mass plagiarism, right? Where everybody's kind of taken, what I read in these books here, and I'm, just telling that as my story now. But it helps us, we don't want to plagiarize, but it helps to read the great authors and see how they influence the way we think about our own stories in life. And every great writer was a great reader as well. And every great musician was a great listener, right? And so, there's the musical example of that. I can, and this is where I'll lean to you for an analogy if it comes to you. It's one thing to take somebody else's riff, Vanilla Ice lifting from Under Pressure or something. It's another thing to be inspired by something and integrate that into your own way of creating.
Yeah, what was it? I just looked up the Pablo Picasso quote: "Good artists copy, great artists steal, and then reinterpret." And yeah, the amount of times that I'm like, I like the sound of that song, I'm going to make my version of that, and then it oftentimes turns out incredibly different. But I needed to start with something.
Yeah,
I needed to start with, I like that, and this is the development of taste. Can probably include this video in the show notes here, but it's Ira Glass talking about taste and the taste and skill gap of, you may have really good taste, but you don't have the skill to match your taste, and that's where the frustration comes in. And sometimes I'm learning, for me, is like there's even like I haven't had enough experience to have a taste spectrum. And the more I experience, the more data that gets plotted on this spectrum, such that I can move the dial around slowly to find, there's that thing. So bringing it back to what you're saying, what I'm hearing is like, read the books, listen to the podcasts, go to trainings, do all those things. You're developing your taste spectrum. And then you're slowly finding what works, what doesn't. And then what it ends up doing is finally integrates into, oh, there's my story.
Yeah.
And there's a winding, trickling path to get to there. And then I can work on the skill to be able to embody that taste.
Mm-hmm.
I would push, I think that's great, Creek. And I would push back a little bit on when you start the skill building. I think it should maybe be earlier in the process with learning the Enneagram, right? Like start applying what you're learning and
Sure.
and pressure testing what you think you know to sort of have the taste and skill co-emerge, you know?
But
You may not have been saying wait till the end, but that's kind of how I heard it. So
I think what Creek was referring to is the gap in the speed at which those two things happen, right?
Okay.
You know, and so, which I get, and I agree with you too, Lee, but we can't just wait till I've read every Enneagram book and listened to every Enneagram podcast and then say, okay, well, let me think about this and make it my own. No, it's an iterative process. It helps to think of it in terms of digestion, right? You know, I can always tell when somebody has digested the material and then turned it into something different, right? You know, transformed.
Do not bring up the chimpanzee
energy.
example.
No, I wasn't. I wasn't.
Okay.
I wasn't. Yeah, converted it to energy. Yes, in a way, right? So, I'm sorry.
Metabolic fuel.
You're not sorry.
No, I got caught in my own analogy. You know, so.
You got caught in your own shit.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Yeah. We can cut some of that part out.
That's got to come out.
I don't know.
So,
No, I think it should. But
my point being is that you can tell when people have read a few books and, you know, attended a few workshops or whatever, and then they start teaching it, and they can parrot back what they've learned, but they can't respond to questions. They can't answer, well, what's behind that and so forth. And that's where the digestion process comes through, the integration process and the iteration process. And this will, I'll loop us back to this idea of stories here. This is not a one and done with our narratives, right? This is a lifetime's worth of work and ongoing. I have been working on the question of what does it mean to strive to feel powerful? What does that look like? How do I do it in bad ways? How do I do it in good ways for 30 years, right? So and I keep getting a better and better story about it. But, you know, I didn't just write it down, put it in a book and move on to the next one. Okay. So iteration, continual revisiting is crucially important to this work.
it goes back to Popper.
I've created a monster.
Yeah. You gave me a pattern to recognize. So seeking to find error or seeking to falsify. You're looking for anomalies. You're honing the pattern recognition, which is telling a better story.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a rigorously interrogated story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I need to start telling myself a better story to not anticipate that these episodes will be under 30 minutes. So
yeah, that was fiction.
Unfortunately, yes.
Fact checkers agree.
All right, folks. Well, that's it for this episode.
Time for our story to come to an end.
No, it's almost time for our story to come to an end. We've got to have a take-home practice. So, how do we practice this better storytelling until we meet again? When you find yourself attributing something to your type strategy or your instinctual bias, ask yourself what else could be true. Challenge your assumption. Humans are notorious rationalizers and projectors, so it shouldn't take you too long to find somewhere where there's another point of view.
Well, that's it for this episode. If you have any comments or questions, confirmations or corrections, you can reach out. Well, at least to Lee and I. Don't talk to Mario.
Yeah, just go away.
Please don't talk to Mario.
Please, just don't.
Yeah.
Now, that reinforces
Yeah.
a negative story
Yeah.
about Mario,
Yeah.
which is fictional.
You can find how to reach out to us through the links in the show notes. But remember... Okay.
I was just going to say, and listen to our other podcasts, and the Enneagram in a Movie and the Awareness to Action Enneagram podcast. Part of the Awareness
away,
to Action
Creek.
podcast network.
I was trying to get this under an hour, but remember, folks, be kind with people and ruthless with ideas. We'll see you in 2 weeks. I've never been loved. I don't know what that feels like.
Oh, your mom's a 2, dude.
Talk about
I feel
talk about your experience of burgers. You know, you go into Five Guys, and you know,
It would be Chipotle.
I could describe all these things from a scientific perspective and why my mouth is watering. And I
Okay,
start to
okay,
go,
okay. Okay, I'll do something.